Vladimir Putin has been betting everything on one assumption: that the West will eventually get tired of funding Ukraine's defense and abandon the fight. But Europe just announced financial commitments that reveal why Putin's entire strategy is based on a fundamental miscalculation about Western capabilities and resolve. The numbers that emerged this week don't just show European support for Ukraine, they reveal the mathematical impossibility of Russian victory in any prolonged conflict with NATO. But what makes these commitments truly devastating for Putin's strategy is their independence from American politics and their sustainability over decades, not just years. But the most shocking revelation isn't the size of European financial support. It's the realization that NATO has been operating far below its actual capacity and is now beginning to mobilize resources that dwarf anything Russia can possibly match. You need to understand these numbers because they reveal why Putin's entire approach to this conflict is doomed to fail, regardless of what happens on any individual battlefield. For over 3 years, Vladimir Putin has based his entire war strategy on a single assumption: that Western democracies lack the staying power for prolonged conflict and will eventually abandon Ukraine when the costs become too high. This wasn't an unreasonable calculation based on historical precedent. Western nations had indeed shown limited appetite for sustained military commitments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts. Putin's advisors had studied American withdrawal from Vietnam and Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, concluding that democracies inevitably lose interest in foreign wars when domestic costs mount. According to this logic, Russia only needed to outlast Western attention spans and financial commitments to achieve victory through attrition. The Kremlin's strategy was explicitly designed around this assumption, with Russian officials regularly predicting that Western support would collapse within months as European and American taxpayers grew tired of funding Ukrainian resistance. But this strategy contained a fatal flaw that Putin's advisors had failed to recognize. They were applying historical patterns from optional wars to an existential conflict that the West now viewed as fundamental to its own security. The invasion of Ukraine hadn't just threatened Ukrainian sovereignty, it had challenged the entire post-World War II international order that formed the foundation of Western prosperity and security. On July 17, 2025, Putin's fundamental assumption about Western staying power was shattered when the European Commission announced financial commitments that revealed the true scale of resources available for Ukrainian support. The Commission unveiled 10 billion euros in immediate investments for Ukraine, leveraged through 2.3 billion euros in loans and grants from European institutions, with the announcement made at the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Rome. But this was just the beginning of a financial commitment that dwarfed anything Putin had anticipated. President Zelensky's call for a Marshall Plan-style approach to Ukrainian reconstruction was immediately backed by concrete European commitments that demonstrated institutional capacity for sustained support that Russia could never match. According to European officials, this initial commitment represented only a fraction of planned long-term investments designed to integrate Ukraine permanently into European economic and security structures. But what made these announcements truly devastating for Russian strategy was their timing and context. Instead of waiting for the war to end, Europe was already planning and funding Ukraine's post-war reconstruction, demonstrating confidence in Ukrainian victory and commitment to long-term engagement that Putin had never encountered before. This wasn't just financial aid. It was a declaration that Europe viewed Ukrainian success as essential to its own security and prosperity. But the true scope of European commitment became clear when the European Commission proposed its 2026 to 2030 budget of 2 trillion euros, with 100 billion euros specifically earmarked for Ukraine's reconstruction and European Union integration. These numbers revealed the mathematical reality that Putin's advisors had been reluctant to acknowledge. Europe alone possessed financial resources that were multiple times larger than Russia's 2 trillion was dwarfed by the European Union entire economy. According to World Bank data, Russia's GDP of approximately 18 trillion economy, while NATO's combined GDP exceeded $45 trillion. But the significance of these numbers went beyond simple economic comparison. The European budget proposal demonstrated institutional capacity to sustain massive financial commitments over multiple years, with built-in mechanisms for adjustment and expansion based on changing circumstances. This wasn't emergency spending that could be reduced when political winds shifted. It was systematic investment in European security that would continue regardless of electoral outcomes or public opinion fluctuations. But the most devastating aspect of this commitment for Putin's strategy was its independence from American politics. Europe was demonstrating that it could sustain Ukrainian support indefinitely, even if American priorities changed, eliminating Putin's hope that political changes in Washington could alter the strategic balance. The mathematical impossibility of Putin's position became even more evident when NATO announced its decision to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, representing what NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called a quantum leap in military investment. This decision would add hundreds of billions of dollars annually to NATO's military capabilities, creating a permanent advantage over Russia that would worsen with each passing year. According to defense analysts, NATO members currently spend an average of 2.61% of GDP on defense, meaning that increasing this to 5% would more than double the alliance's military spending over the next decade. But the significance of this commitment went far beyond simple spending increases. NATO's combined GDP of $45 trillion meant that $5 trillion would be spent annually in military investment, an amount equivalent to Russia's entire economy each year. This level of sustained military investment would create technological and capability advantages that Russia could never hope to match, regardless of how much of its smaller economy was devoted to defense spending. But the most sophisticated aspect of this strategy was its focus on developing long-term capabilities rather than immediate military needs. NATO was essentially using the conflict in Ukraine as justification for military investments that would secure Western superiority for decades, turning Putin's invasion into the catalyst for Russia's permanent military irrelevance. But the moment that truly revealed the hopelessness of Putin's position came when financial analysts calculated the sustainability of these Western commitments compared to Russia's declining economic capacity. According to the Institute for the Study of War, economic sanctions and military spending were seriously risking Putin's ability to balance butter and guns, maintaining both military operations and domestic economic stability. Russia's economy was already showing signs of strain from sustaining military operations that consumed an estimated 30 to 40% of government spending, while Western economies were supporting Ukraine with less than 1% of their combined GDP. The mathematical implications were staggering. The West could increase its support for Ukraine by 1,000% and still be spending a smaller percentage of its economy on the conflict than Russia was currently spending. But the most devastating revelation was the sustainability comparison. Russia's economy was shrinking under sanctions while devoting unsustainable percentages to military spending, while Western economies continued growing while providing Ukrainian support that represented rounding errors in their national budgets. This created a strategic dynamic where time worked entirely in favor of the West, with every passing month strengthening Western capabilities while depleting Russian resources. Putin had walked into an economic war of attrition against opponents with 22 times his resources and unlimited capacity for sustained engagement. Recognizing the mathematical impossibility of victory through conventional means, Western leaders began implementing a comprehensive strategy designed to exploit Russia's fundamental resource disadvantages while building Ukrainian capabilities that would guarantee long-term security. The European Marshall Plan for Ukraine wasn't just about reconstruction. It was about creating economic integration that would make Ukrainian success essential to European prosperity, ensuring permanent Western commitment to Ukrainian security. NATO's decision to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP included specific provisions for Ukrainian military integration, with plans to standardize Ukrainian forces on NATO equipment and training protocols that would create permanent interoperability. But the most sophisticated aspect of this strategy was its use of economic integration to create political constituencies for continued support. By investing European resources in Ukrainian reconstruction and development, the West was creating economic relationships that would generate domestic political pressure for sustained engagement, regardless of changing political leadership. This approach transformed Ukrainian success from a foreign policy objective into a domestic economic necessity for European nations, creating the kind of permanent commitment that Putin's strategy could never overcome. The result was a strategic framework where Ukrainian victory became mathematically inevitable, given sufficient time and continued Western engagement. Today, Vladimir Putin faces a strategic reality that his advisors have been reluctant to acknowledge. Russia is fighting an economic and military war against opponents with 22 times its resources and institutional capacity for sustained engagement that improves over time. The European commitments announced this week represent only the beginning of Western financial engagement, with systematic investments planned over decades that will permanently integrate Ukraine into Western economic and security structures. NATO's decision to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP will generate annual military investments equal to Russia's entire economy, creating permanent technological and capability advantages that Putin cannot overcome through conventional means. But the most devastating aspect of Putin's current position isn't just the resource disparity, it's the sustainability advantage that compounds over time. While Russia's economy shrinks under sanctions and unsustainable military spending, Western economies continue growing while providing Ukrainian support that represents minimal percentages of their national resources. The mathematical reality is inescapable. Putin is fighting a war of attrition against opponents with unlimited resources and unlimited time, making Russian defeat not just likely, but mathematically certain, given sufficient Western patience and resolve. The financial commitments announced by Europe this week have revealed the fundamental asymmetry that will determine this conflict's outcome. Russia's limited resources versus the West's virtually unlimited capacity for sustained engagement. Putin's strategy of outlasting Western resolve has collided with the mathematical reality of NATO's $45 trillion, combined economy and institutional capacity for multi-decade commitments that dwarf anything Russia can possibly match. The war that Putin started to demonstrate Russian strength has instead triggered Western investments that will guarantee Russian military and economic irrelevance for generations. But the most significant revelation isn't the size of Western resources. It's the discovery that the West has been operating far below its actual capacity and is now beginning to mobilize capabilities that make Russian victory mathematically impossible. The question is no longer whether Putin can win this war, it's whether he can find a way to end it before the full weight of Western economic and military superiority makes Russian defeat absolutely inevitable.